a lot of times when we say we're going to have conversations about race, people don't necessarily really want to have real conversations. We've jumped around on this thing for a long time. In fact, it used to be back in the 60s, they would actually define this conversation very differently. Like there was actually a term for it. In every sort of decade, there's been a different term for this thing we're going to talk about now. So in the 50s and 60s, right, it would be defined as, it was called the Negro problem, right? That was what it was called, the Negro problem. How are we going to solve the Negro problem? And at that time, that was very much a white-black binary, because prior to 1965, when immigration restrictions that had been in place since the 1880s and the 1920s were lifted, that was pretty much the binary. So I say, how are we going to solve the Negro problem, right? Because that was apparently the problem. Black folks were the problem, the riddle to be solved, right? Then we progressed a little bit, and so by the 70s and the 80s, it was no longer being called the Negro problem or the black problem. It was called, how are we going to deal with diversity? That was the word by the 80s, right? Diversity, because that's a pretty little term. That means nothing and everything all at once, which is an amazing linguistic trick. When you can make a word mean everything and nothing, you have pulled off a hell of a linguistic trick. So that was the conversation, right? How are we going to solve the problem of diversity, or maybe multiculturalism? That was the other term. Then by the 90s, we had President Clinton saying we need to have a national dialogue on race. Now notice he didn't say racism. He said national dialogue on race, which is a very interesting distinction from racism. You could talk about race forever and never talk about racism if you don't want to, and that's exactly what happened. So we had this national dialogue on race. It lasted about 47 minutes. And it never actually dealt with racism. Now, what I'm here to say, and what a lot of folks I work with are wanting us to talk about, is something quite a bit different. It's not a Negro problem, quote unquote. It's not diversity and multiculturalism. It's not a conversation about race. What we have is not a race problem in this country. What we have is not a diversity problem in this country. And what we have is definitely not a quote unquote Negro problem in this country. What we have is a white problem in this country. And I want to be clear what I mean, because it's about that moment when white folks start to get nervous in my audiences, right? This is when white folks are like, what? What? Like, this is going to be an hour of this? Oh, God, this is awful. Like, can I leave and not be conspicuous? Because he just said white people are the problem. That's not what I said. I said we have a white problem. I didn't say we had a white people problem. I'm talking about white people. Everybody said, oh, Tim Wise, you hate white people. Actually, I love me some white people. Absolutely love me some white people. I'm my wife that I talked about a minute ago, been married since 1998. She's white. I love her. Love her. Wouldn't trade her in for anything. Love her, right? My children, they're both white, which is what happens when two white people make babies. It sort of comes out that way, you know, so I love them. My mom, love her. She's white. My dad, I don't get along with him, but it's not because he's white. It's about some other stuff that I'm not going to get into this evening, because this is not a therapy session, but... Right? But they're all white, love them. It's not about white people, it's about whiteness. And that is not the same thing. Whiteness is a political project. And I'm going to argue that blackness is a political project. Brownness is a political project. This is not about ancestry, it's definitely not about color. Because all throughout history, there have been folks of color, as we would refer to them now, who have upheld the political project of whiteness. That's what you do when you rat out the slave rebellion that's about to happen on the plantation. That's about whiteness. Right? And there have been white folks who have resisted whiteness and acted in solidarity with peoples of color in keeping with the political project of blackness or brownness. We're talking about whiteness as a political construct and a social construct, not as an ancestral thing. So when I say we have a white problem, I mean we have a problem with this thing called whiteness, a system of inequity and inequality that one can choose to defend or resist.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing super great from wherever you're watching us from. I'm your host and presenter, G-Tech Stories. In today's video, we're going to be learning what it is that is happening in the United States today, in as much as all these problems are always being tried to shift trying to shift it to black people. But we have Tim Wise, a prominent anti-racism educator and author, who has long argued that racism in America is not merely a black problem, but a white problem, meaning it is rooted in historical, institutional, and psychological systems maintained and defended by white America. Now, according to Tim Wise, American society encourages silence around racism, particularly among white people. Now, in order to preserve an illusion of national unity and what is called meritocracy, This silence, however, is not neutral. It is an active choice that allows systemic racism to endure. Now, Dr. Tim Wise Dr. Tim Wise contends that unless white Americans are willing to confront their own role individually and collectively in sustaining racial inequality, the real progress cannot occur. This is it. Is fighting against the push towards a colorblind society, a society where you're allowed to see that everything is going okay in as much as things are not going okay. You're not allowed to talk about these things. Dr. Tim Wise counteract this by saying that the first solution to a problem is finding and talking about the problem. And so if the problem of the United States is because of racism, we need voices that talks about this. We need black people to talk about this. We also need white people to also talk about this, call themselves out, agree that a mistake was done. But how can we go through this right now? That's what Mr. Dr. Tim Wise contends while he was sharing this presentation with everybody. Now, one of the central ways white America promotes silence about racism is through the doctrine of colorblindness. This is the idea that we should no longer see race and should treat everyone equally without regard to racial identity. While this might sound noble on the surface, Dr. Tim Wise critiques colorblindness as a form of denial, right? If one cannot see race, then one cannot see racism. This perspective obscures the lived realities of people of color, and dismisses the enduring impact of historical injustice. More critically, colorblindness allows white people to ignore their own racial privilege, treating racism as a thing of the past or as an occasional aberration rather than structural issues embedded in every facet of American life, from education to housing, from employment to criminal justice. So these are the things that affect black people. So people need to talk about this. America needs to address the issue of racism into the United States. Let's watch the video. I'll be back. If you're watching us for the first time, I'll most definitely request you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get so we can offer you. But until then, let's watch the video. I'll be back.
Right. So it isn't about the level of melanin in one's skin. It's not about one's ancestry or continent of origin. It is about how one comes to this thing called whiteness that we need to worry about. And the problem of whiteness, the white problem, is one principally of this unremitting denial, this inability of people called white because of this thing called whiteness and what it does to us in so many cases, to prevent us from seeing clearly what folks of color can see. Not because we have some inherent vision problem. Right? This is a socially constructed astigmatism. A socially constructed astigmatism that jacks our vision up to where we can't see the ink blot the way other folks do, right? You know, a Rorschach test where they hold up the ink blot and they say, what do you see? Right? And this whole country is one big ink blot when it comes to race. Folks of color can look at it, they see shapes and things that white folks apparently, because of this thing called whiteness, have a hard time making out. Right? And it's always been that way. It's very hard to have a conversation about race or racism, right? When a large chunk of the nation's population can't see what you're talking about. It's like having a book club with 200 people in it or something, and like half the room read all 400 pages, and the other half of the room read the preface. And now we're gonna get together and talk about the book. And we get together in the room, folks are like, hey, did you like the book? And you're like, man, the first 9 pages were awesome. Yeah, well, what about the other 391? Well, I haven't read it yet, but I'll let you know, right? Really? Like, that's where we are. Some people have read the whole book. Some people are at the beginning of the book. It's very difficult. And some folks are at the beginning of the book and figure like they know what the book's about. They don't even need to read it anymore. We're just gonna put the book down, read the cliff notes, get it online, like, you know, right? Whatever, right? And so it's very hard to have a conversation when white folks are in such profound denial about the problem. Let me just document what I'm saying, because that might sound hyperbolic, but it's not. It's provable, it's incontrovertible and factual. So recent surveys, for example, where they ask white folks, hey, just out of curiosity, you know, how do you think black and brown folks are doing relative to white folks? How are people of color doing with regard to health outcomes and educational outcomes, income, occupational status, wealth, life expectancy, all of those things, right? All the different indicators of social well-being. And when white folks are asked that question, the clear majority of us in these surveys say that we believe black and brown folk are doing just as well or better than we are, right? That their incomes are equal to or higher than white income, that their wealth and assets higher or equal to white wealth and assets. Health outcomes, that they're just as healthy, just as likely to have good health care, just as likely to have good housing opportunities and good educational opportunities. That's what the data says white folks believe, right? That somehow there's this equanimity now, not just of opportunity, which you know we believe. Oh, everybody has equal opportunity. There's no racism anymore. We're not just talking about equal opportunity. We're saying that white folks actually think we have obtained equal results. Now, how does one believe that when every single indicator that I just rattled off says exactly the opposite? And it's not even like it's close, right? It's not even like it's like a 54-46, like this is sort of a toss-up kind of deal. It's not even close to that. What's the reality? People of color, let's talk about unemployment. Labor Department data from just a month ago, not 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, last month, says what? African American folk with a college degree, almost twice as likely as white folks to be out of work, regardless of their major, by the way. Black folks with engineering degrees still twice as likely to be unemployed compared to white engineering degree folk, right? So, by the way, this is just sort of as a side note, like this is sort of interesting, right? Because if people of color with the same education are twice as likely to be unemployed, there goes that whole argument about they're taking all the jobs. Right? The hell jobs are black and brown folks taking from white people? Are these in Second Life? Is this on Farmville? Where are these jobs? Right? They're not in the real economy, apparently. Black folks with degrees twice as likely to be out of work as white folks. Latino folk with degrees about 55-60% more likely than comparable whites to be out of work. Asian American and Pacific Islanders with degrees about 25 to 30% more likely than comparable whites to be out of work. Indigenous Native North American peoples with degrees 60% more likely than comparable white folks to be out of work. So across the board, this idea that these folk over here are doing just as well or even better is nonsense. It's sort of funny, right? We say, oh, they're taking all the jobs. First of all, like, this is my thing. Like, I'm not a real stickler on this, but I just feel like if you're gonna be a bigot, you need to be consistent. So, like, it won't do for you to say that black and brown folks are taking all the jobs and then turn around and say, but they're all lazy and just getting welfare. Like, you can't have it both ways, right? You have to pick a bigotry. Like, just pick one. Like, either they're lazy or they're taking all the jobs, but it can't be both, right? It's actually neither, but you can't do both. Like, if you're lazy, you're not taking all the jobs, like, by definition. And if you took all the jobs, you are like the opposite of whatever lazy looks like, right? So I just don't like moving targets with my racist. That's all I ask. Like, just be consistent. Pick one, stay there, so I know what I'm aiming at, right? Truth, of course, is neither one are right, but that's what you hear because whiteness has convinced, apparently, a lot of white folk and some people of color that this thing is equal now, that everything is fine now. What else other than unemployment? Well, we know folks of color about 2.5 to 3 times more likely than white folks to be poor. So if we believe that that's equal, it's certainly not true. We know that the average white family in this country has about 20 times the net worth of the typical black family, 18 times the net worth of the typical Latino family, about 50% greater net worth than the typical Asian American family, even though Bill O'Reilly insists that all the Asian folk are doing fine. Right? But compared to white folk, that's actually not true when you break the data down. That's a lie that right-wing folks tell to try to divide and conquer people of color and get black folks fighting Asian folk and vice versa. It's not right. It's not accurate. Right? 20-to-1 wealth, white to black. How'd that happen? Is that because white people worked harder, prayed harder, have some superior investment wisdom? Are you kidding? Y'all paid attention to Wall Street. It melted down a few years ago. That wasn't black people. That wasn't Mexicans, documented or not. Right? That wasn't Asian Americans. It wasn't indigenous people. That was like the wealthiest, smartest, best MBA having, highest SAT score having white guys on Wall Street, and they jacked the economy and destroyed it. You're welcome. Right? $12 trillion lost by rich white men, almost all of it. Sometimes white folks get very nervous when I say, they're like, oh, well, you shouldn't point out that they're white, that's racist. No, it's descriptive. Right? And if they were black, we'd have noticed that. Like if black folks made off with $12 trillion of white people's money, somebody would have been like, what the hell? Where these black people took all this money? How did they even get this money? How did they get this job? Oh, it's affirmative action. I know how they got it. Oh, yeah. Gave all those people jobs they weren't qualified for. Well, a handful of rich white men lost $12 trillion, but nobody's questioned white men's access to banking. Nobody's like, that's it, white men, y'all are done. No more banking jobs for y'all. That's it. You've proven yourself incompetent, criminal, unable, right? That's the point. So that 20-to-1 wealth gap is not about talent. It's not about merit. It's not about ability. It's about access and power and the history, the cumulative history of unequal access. Over time, wealth accumulates, right? So even if income is going up for people of color, even if the income gaps are narrowing, and they are a little bit, for sure, not enough, but a little bit over the last 20, 30 years. But the wealth gap is actually expanding because wealth grows exponentially. Income grows arithmetically, right? So essentially when you have things handed down to you, even if it's not much, just a little house or, intergenerational transfer, somebody helping you out with college, paying off college loans, right? Or maybe a down payment on a house. So as a result of white families being in a position to do that more often for their children than families of color, we have, young white couples, let's say, that are starting out in their 20s, just got married, got out of grad school, whatever, and they're debt free in a much higher capacity. Not most, I'm not saying everybody is, but I'm saying overwhelmingly what the data finds, for instance, is that young white couples starting out a few years out of college start out with about $20,000 head start in terms of assets compared to Black and Latino families. Right? And that's because of a degree of intergenerational transfer. So it's just a little head start, but over time that accumulates. Right? If I start out debt-free, I'm able to start saving money. And actually what the research has found is that Black and Latino families that are doing pretty well in terms of their occupational status and their income, not only are they not getting help from their parents, because in many cases their parents weren't in a position to help them, right? But actually the younger Black and brown folks are actually sending money back to their parents. Right? Helping relatives that are older than them who haven't had the same access and opportunity. So instead of the money trail going from older to younger, in Black and brown families, it's actually going from younger to older, right? Which hurts the ability to accumulate wealth. It also says a lot, doesn't it, about which families are functional and which ones are. Because folks in this country like to say Black and brown families aren't functional. But I would say that when you're helping your mom and you're helping your uncle and your auntie and you're helping your cousins and you're helping people, I'd say that's a pretty functional family, right? But we don't think of it that way in this country, right? That's how we talk about race. So if white folks are convinced that everything is equal and everything's fine, how do we have a conversation? How do we have a conversation when the research says, for instance, that schools that serve mostly Black and Latino children, for instance, are 10 times more likely to be schools with concentrated poverty than the schools that white children attend? Twice as likely if you're Black or Latino to be taught by the least experienced teachers. Half as likely as white folks to have the most experienced teachers. 5 times more likely, at least in some states, it's up to 9 times more likely to be arrested for drugs if you're Black or Latino relative to white folks, even though the rates of drug use are virtually identical between white, Black, and brown. Contrary to the stereotype, right? The data says white folks just as likely to use drugs, just as likely to sell drugs. And by the way, I don't actually need government data to tell me that. Like, I know that from personal experience. Like, if the war on drugs was actually about drugs as opposed to race and the control of certain populations, if it was actually about drugs, I promise you, I would not be giving this talk tonight. Because I don't think they'd let you Skype in a speech from prison, which is where I would be if the war on drugs was about drugs. That's all I'm saying. The statute of limitations has run out on this thing, so I can be honest. Right? Can't touch me now, I'm good. Right? And I don't do that. I'm not trying to brag or anything. Like, I'm not saying do drugs. I have asthma now. Like, I can't do any of that. I'm done with that. But I'm just saying, right? And there was a time, and the war on drugs never caught me, and it didn't catch many people like me. Not because we weren't doing the crime, but because we weren't the ones upon whom law enforcement focused their efforts. And so how can we say that we're in this equitable space when we have that kind of ongoing disparity? But the problem is that denial isn't really new. See, I guess if it were, we could sort of deal with it, right? I mean, if people are just sort of in denial because they haven't heard the data and they're not familiar with the statistics, then we could just sort of fill in the gaps of their knowledge and we could move on and everything would be all right. But that's not really what we're up against. It's not just ignorance in the simple sort of pure sense of that word, right? It's much deeper than that. Denial is sort of cultivated ignorance, right? Like, you got to work at that. And apparently white folks have been working at that for a long time because whiteness has encouraged us to do so. So you can actually go back half century to the early 60s and look at the polling that was done in those days. Forget now. Like, I understand a lot of young white folks in particular might think that racism nowadays isn't as big a deal. I get it, you know. But I think most everybody would acknowledge that it was sort of rough in the early 60s, before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act, right? That's why we had a civil rights movement. That wasn't done for fun. That was because there was some stuff wrong, right? So in the early 60s, if you ask anybody in America, regardless of their politics, they're all going to acknowledge that, yeah, there was a time, long time ago, when people of color weren't treated equally. But here's what's interesting. If you go back and look at the polls that were done then, about then, right? In other words, when 1963 wasn't the past, when it wasn't 51 years in the rearview mirror, but when it was happening, like at the time, and they asked white folks that, and Gallup did, the Gallup poll organization, they went out, they asked white folks, hey, do you think that, they use the term racial minorities, do you think racial minorities are treated equally in your community in housing, education, and job opportunities? Now, of course, the answer, a little over a half century later, is obviously no. But in 1963, 2 out of 3 white folks said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Yeah, they're treated fully equally. Think about that. Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed. That's the year of the March on Washington. 225,000 people marching in the late August heat in DC. People don't do that for fun. They do it because there's something wrong. But apparently 2 out of 3 white folks didn't understand. They're watching the TV that night, and you know it. They're all watching the TV because that's all they had to do in 1963. We didn't have 400 channels and video games and all kinds of distractions. Like, there were 3 channels, and they went off at 11:30. Right? They played the national anthem, and then it was just fuzz for like 7 hours. Some of the young folks in here are like, what? That's the craziest thing I ever heard of. But the older folks, you know, national anthem, there's the flag, and then it's for like 7 hours. And in 1963, that's all people had to do. So everybody was watching the TV. You couldn't have missed what was going on. It's not like white folks didn't see, oh, there's this march happening. Oh, there's Birmingham, 1963, children's campaign, bombing of the 16th Street Church in downtown Birmingham, the murder of Medgar Evers in Jackson, right? Governor Wallace in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama. This stuff, everybody knew this was happening, but apparently 2 out of 3 white folks were looking at the TV screen like, I don't get it. Everything's fine. I don't know, what are you talking about? Racism, what? Right? 1962, Gallup asked white folks if they thought that black children had equal educational opportunity. I think the way they worded it was, do you think black children have just as good a chance to get a good, high-quality education as white children in this country? And again, 52 years later, we know the answer was no, right? It's easy. No sweat off our back, is it, to acknowledge how bad it was 52 years ago. But in 1962, when white Americans were asked that question, 87 out of 100 said, oh yeah, they have just as good a chance to get a good education as white children. What's wrong? Nothing wrong. Discrimination, what? Sort of interesting. How is it that otherwise functional, reasonably intelligent people could be so wrong? Either there's something wrong with them, or there's something about the system that's teaching them not to pay attention to this, not to notice this. And see, I think it's the latter. I think most people are good people. I think most of those white folks that didn't see it were good folks, caring, decent, compassionate folks, with some obvious exceptions duly noted, right? But I think most people were decent people. I think most people are decent people who don't intend to oppress. But the reality is 87 out of 100 white folks, or 2/3 on that other question, just didn't see it. Why? Because they didn't have to. That's why. White folks had the luxury, didn't they? The privilege of being oblivious. And here's the thing. No matter what you think has changed in 52 years, that right there has not changed. Just as in 1962, white folks weren't going to get tested on their knowledge of black and brown truth, and we're still not tested on that. We can continue to be utterly ignorant to the reality of how people of color in this country and in places like Ferguson experience law enforcement. We can continue to be ignorant to that and have nothing happen to us. It's not on the test. We can be considered competent, informed, educated citizens and know nothing about people of color's reality. A lot of stuff has changed in 50 years. That has remained frighteningly, disturbingly, unremittingly the same. That privilege of obliviousness, right? Doesn't make us bad people. It just means we got a really messed up system, because what system allows you to be ignorant to social truth like that? Like, it's important to understand your society correctly. It's really important. That's why we have children take civics classes and history classes, right? It's not just because we have nothing better to do. The idea is we want them to understand the world they live in. But apparently we got folks growing up not having any clue about the world they live in, because they're never taught this stuff. You don't have to know this stuff. Like if you're not required to know better, you probably won't know better. It's like I'm oblivious to calculus, y'all. You know why? Because I never took it. You know why I didn't take it? Because they did not make me, and I was not going to volunteer. That's why. Right? I wasn't going to take it unless you made me take calculus. I knew I wasn't a good math student. So I got into high school. They're like, okay, so our rule, I grew up in Nashville, went to Metro School, Metropolitan National School, public schools. And the rule was you had to have 3 years of math. I'm like, all right, how can I do 3 years of math and not take calculus? I'm going to take Algebra 1 again. That's how I'm going to do that. Take it in 8th grade. I'm going to take it again in 9th grade. See if I can do better than I did in the 8th. And then I'll take geometry. And then I'll take Algebra 2. I won't even take trig. That's how smart I am. I'm going to avoid all of this. And it worked. They didn't make me learn it. As a result, I don't know it. So if I were to stand up here at this podium and start trying to give you calculus information, y'all would recognize very quickly that I do not know what I'm talking about. In fact, you would say, wait, hold up. Didn't he just tell us he never took the class? Aha, exactly. But in this country, that's how we do race. White folks apparently think that we know racism better than black and brown folks, and we never took the class. When it comes to sexism, men in this country think we know sexism better than women know about sexism, and we never had to take the class, right? For those who are straight or cisgendered, we think we know the reality of heterosexism, homophobia, straight supremacy better than LGBT folks, and we never took the class. People with money think they understand the class system better than the poor, and they never had to take the class. You understand, when you're a member of the dominant group, you have the luxury of not taking the class, so to speak. And as a result, you come out the other end with this gap in knowledge. But it's always been that way. And it's sort of like that movie, The Matrix. You ever see The Matrix? It's a good movie. If you get a chance to see it, you should see it, even though Keanu Reeves is the main dude. Like, it's still a pretty good movie, in spite of him, because Lawrence Fishburne is in it, and that redeems the movie. That's why. And it's well written. It's a good film. You should see it. And if you've seen it already, you should see it again. And you should pay very close attention to it as a film about race, metaphorically. Because if you remember, near the very beginning of the film, right, Keanu Reeves' character is offered 2 pills by Lawrence Fishburne's character, right? One is red and one is blue. And this is very early on in the film, it's sort of key to the plot, right? And Fishburne's character says to Reeves' character, says, look, you can take either of these pills. You want to take the blue pill? You can go back to sleep, and you can remain oblivious. That's where everybody else is. Just about everybody in the world is asleep and oblivious and ignorant. They're all taking the blue pill. So if that's what you want to do, go ahead. You can go back to sleep. You'll never know what's really going on. Or you can take this red pill, and you can have enlightenment, and I can take you down the rabbit hole and show you how far it goes. And he takes the red pill, of course, which is good, because like if he takes the blue pill and goes to sleep, it's like a 10-minute movie. So it's sort of helpful for us as moviegoers that he goes red, Takes the red pill, all of a sudden he starts seeing everything that's happening in the background, right? He starts to see all this stuff. And that's sort of how race functions. It's how identity of all types functions, right? When you're a member of the dominant group, you have the luxury of just taking that blue pill all the time and going back to sleep. In fact, it's so normalized that you don't even know you're on the blue pill. Like if you're a member of the dominant group, you're walking around with a blue pill IV attached to your veins. You don't even know you have it. You're like clunking around with the IV drip and the blue pill stuff. And you're just like, what? Racism? Sexism? Right? And then the folks who are the marginalized group populations who have to take the red pill just to figure out what is going on. Why is their life the way their life is? They got the red pill. They're like, racism. Do you see it? And we're like, no, blue pill. I'm a blue pill. I don't know what you're talking about. Right? Sexism, do you see it? And guys are like, no, blue pill. And I know like guys and blue pill means different stuff in the modern era. I'm not talking about that blue pill. I'm not talking about Pfizer's blue pill. I do find it interesting everybody gets that joke, though. That's how good the marketing is on that one. Right? Not talking about that. I'm talking about the Matrix, right? So you have the luxury of taking that blue pill and going back to sleep. And so it's really hard to have a conversation, isn't it, about these subjects when a large chunk of the American population has been mainlining that blue pill for so many years. I think we're seeing this right now in Ferguson. And I guess we don't know what's going to happen, but I think we probably know what's going to happen. I'd like to think I'm wrong, but I don't have much confidence in the likelihood that I'll be wrong. We'll see. It's taken a little bit longer than maybe some folks thought, so maybe that's a good sign. It's hard to read, right? But I think it's a really good example of how the lens of whiteness gets in the way of being honest about these subjects and really gets in the way of us moving forward as a country. Right? So if you look at what's going on over there, I mean, talk about an ink blot, talk about a racial Rorschach test, right? There was a Pew Research Center poll a couple months back, shortly after Mike Brown was killed, mid-August, late August, where they asked black folks and white folks in particular if they thought that the killing of Michael Brown and the aftermath of all that sort of, taught us any interesting lessons or had anything important to say about race, which is a really vague way of putting it, right? It's not like they asked, do you think the killing of Mike Brown was evidence of institutional white supremacy? They didn't say it like that. They just were like, do y'all think it has anything at all to do with race? They also asked this question back after Katrina. I remember the same kind of question. Do you think that the aftermath of the flooding of New Orleans has anything at all to tell us about race in America, right? That's an easy, that's like so vague, it wouldn't take much to just say yes. Just like say yes, just say yes, right? It's easy. And when they asked that question to black folks, like 95% in the Katrina example and like 89, 90% in the Mike Brown example said yes, of course. When they asked white folks, in both of those, 37% said yes, the rest disagreed. It's pretty consistent. 37% of white folks apparently think that the disproportionate impact on black folks and brown folk in New Orleans might have had something to do with race. And the other 63% are like, no, I don't see it. I don't see it. I think it was about water. And Mike Brown, no, that's got nothing to do with race. For real, because here's the deal. I defy you to find me one case in the history of this country where a law enforcement official shot a white man in the street, let him bleed out for 4 hours with no medical attention. Find me one. One. You won't find one. Not in the past, and it isn't going to happen in the future. Shoot a man dead and not offer medical attention. Because here's the thing, regardless of what you think did or did not happen between Darren Wilson and Mike Brown, here's what I know the law requires of law enforcement after they shoot somebody. You got to render assistance at that point. That's an expectation, not just an ethical one, but a legal one. You don't just get to stand around and watch a dude bleed out in the street when you don't know he's dead yet. You're supposed to render assistance. But not only did Officer Wilson and the other cop who showed up not do that, they didn't let the ME in. They didn't let any paramedics in for about 45 minutes to an hour. They didn't cover him for an hour. So when you say it's not about race, how is that not? You don't even respect the body enough. Leave the body out on the street bleeding, face down on the pavement for 4 hours. That's what folks used to do when they strung folks up by trees, leave them out there for people to see. People say that's not about race. Unless you can find me an example where that happened to a white person, then I'm going to tell you that it is. That level of disrespect does not happen to us by and large. I'm not saying that white folks never got shot by cops. I'm just saying it plays out quite a bit differently. And for those who think it wasn't about race, I'm just always fascinated, like, regardless of what you think the shooting did and did not happen, after all, I guess there are multiple versions, and we're never really going to know, are we? I mean, that's the thing. We got different witnesses with different versions of this thing, and I guess we're never really going to know. But here's what I do know. Like, in the aftermath of when that happened, I don't know for sure whether the shooting was about race, and I don't much care. Like, I get bored by that conversation. Be like, is Darren Wilson a racist? I don't know. Was George Zimmerman a racist? I don't know. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested about what's in an individual shooter's heart. Like, that to me is a boring conversation. It's not the one we need to have, right? The conversation is something much deeper. How did we respond to these incidents? And when you look at the way we responded to them, that's when you start to see something that's wrong. Because within a couple of days of the shooting, what we see on social media, right? Same people who were saying this had nothing to do with race were sending pictures around, weren't they? I'm sure some of y'all saw them. They went around hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of times. There was one in particular of a black guy with a gun pointed at the camera and a wad of cash in his mouth and like some weed on the table, right? And it was somebody who was trying to pass that off as Mike Brown, sending that picture around saying, oh, here's your gentle giant, right? Of course, it wasn't Mike Brown, it's just another black dude, right? Wasn't Mike Brown at all, just a black dude. But apparently a lot of white folks believed it was Mike Brown because that's just how easy it is for us to see a criminal in the face of any black man. Oh, well, he must be that guy. Somebody said he was. I'm not even going to research it. I'm not even going to try to question it. So whether or not the shooting was about race, I'm pretty sure that was. And then they start sending around pictures of a guy they said was Darren Wilson, the cop, right? Sitting in a hospital bed with his orbital socket blown out, all this big bruise on his face. And they say, this is what the gentle giant did to Darren Wilson, right? But that wasn't Darren Wilson. That was some like motocross racer that had a bad wreck like 8 years ago and busted up his face. Wasn't Darren Wilson, but people believed it was Darren Wilson. Oh my God, look at him. He's been battered and bruised. That's hilarious because there's video of Darren Wilson circling the body for 45 minutes and he's not looking at his face. He's not bleeding. He's not bruised. There's no visible injury. The original report that was filed by another cop who came and interviewed him does not mention any injury to him whatsoever. But now all of a sudden his orbital socket was blown out and people believe that. So I don't know if the shooting was about race, but I think that was. The rapidity with which we accepted that story had something to do with race. When the peaceful, completely peaceful protesters went to the Cardinals-Dodgers game during the playoffs, stood outside the baseball stadium in downtown St. Louis, and they weren't causing any trouble. Just had some signs trying to raise attention, figured that was a good place to try to raise attention the night before they'd gone to the symphony and done the same. Like, these some brave young people, right? Just like show up at the symphony, be like, hey, bam, like right in the middle of the symphony orchestra, you're like, we're gonna talk about Mike Brown. Now that's guts, like I love that. And then they showed up at the Cardinals game where some folks are drinking, right? Like, and now I'm gonna confront you with this, well, I know you're drunk. That takes a lot of courage. And of course, what was the response? Well, I don't know if you saw the videos or not, but these Cardinals fans come out, these white folks are like, go back to Africa, get a job, pull up your pants, saying things like, we are the ones who give y'all the rights that you have in the first place, right? So I don't know if the shooting was about race, but I think that was, right? So you don't even have to ask about the incident. When you see people line up the way they line up, that starts to tell you whether it's about race or not. Same thing happened with Zimmerman and Trayvon. Before we ever heard George Zimmerman's version of that story, before he ever had a chance to even articulate, oh, I was getting beaten and throttled and I'd been jumped and he reached for my gun, which is crazy fascinating because his gun, according to the video that he's showing police the day after the shooting, was right here. Y'all see the video? He's like, I reached back behind and wait a minute, behind? I thought you were on the ground getting beaten by Trayvon. And so now you're laying on your gun, but he's reaching for your gun that he can't even see that's back here. Fascinating. Right? Fascinating that the prosecution can't win a case with that evidence. But what happened before George Zimmerman even gave us the story about getting beaten? The vast majority of white folks, particularly white reactionary conservative folks in this country, were already lining up behind him because they figured Trayvon had to be a thug. Right? Oh, Geraldo and all these guys are like, look at him, he's a giant. They showed the video from the store where he got the Arizona iced tea, right, and the Skittles. He's a giant. Look at him. Look how tall he is. Right? Being tall while black, right? Apparently a criminal offense. And he wasn't even that tall. He's 6'2". Somebody was like, he's 6'4". He was 5'11". At least that's his height when they stretched him out on the table at the morgue. So unless he's a human shrinky dink, I'm gonna assume that he was 5'11" when he was at the store and when he was confronted by George Zimmerman. But see, we made him big. And then Mike Brown, he's huge, 300 pounds, my goodness, right? Like these are excuses for police violence, but for a lot of white folks, we can't see it. A couple other things we can't see. When you're done tonight, when you're done here and you leave, I want you to go back and I want you to Google Target men with guns and see the photos that come up. White dudes with semi-automatic weapons walking around big box stores like Target and Walmart and Costco or whatever. Big semi-automatic rifles like strapped to them. Nobody's arresting them. Nobody's calling the cops. Nobody's shooting them. John Crawford goes into a Walmart in Akron, outside of Akron, right? And he doesn't even, it's a gun they sell. It's an air rifle. It's not a semi-automatic assault weapon of any type. It's an air rifle. And he's...
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching us from. The following are the perspectives of things that we need to talk about while addressing the question of, color blindness, the question of remaining silence, right? Now, you need to know that silence is used as a political tool. Yes, Dr. Tim Weiss argues that silence is not just personal reaction to racism. It is a political tool wielded by white America to protect its comfort and dominance. When individuals, particularly white individuals, are taught to avoid discussions of race for fear or discomfort or confrontation, the effective uphold the status quo. Schools often avoid teaching the full scope of slavery, segregation, or colonialism. Workplaces penalize employees who speak about discrimination. Even in families, children are frequently raised to believe that talking about race is impolite or divisive. This collective silence, Dr. Tim Wise notes, it functions to suppress anti-racist activists and reinforces white innocence while marginalizing those who suffer from the racial harm. And I've seen the fight towards, you know, racism being really, really oppressed. History books are being banned, and these are the things that teaches people the reality. These are the books that, you know, they help us, they remind us how to deal with these issues. But you see, the government recently, some like 4 months ago, when libraries that taught history, black history, were being banned because of why? Because these people fear what is called accountability. Teachers are being sacked from job for teaching students what is called race and racism. And you get to know that this is really important because they don't want you to talk about it, because to them, the society is okay. While they're remaining silent, the same thing is affecting black people. Now, the psychological investment in whiteness. We get to have a discourse in regards to this. Tim Wise frequently points to the psychological wages of whiteness, a term originally coined by W.E.B. Du Bois to describe an earned sense of superiority, safety, and belonging that whiteness afford in America. Many white Americans are invested, consciously or unconsciously, in maintaining these privileges. Acknowledging racism and confronting white supremacy threatens this psychological comfort, so silence becomes a protective mechanism. While people are often taught that their lives are normal and universal, and therefore they resist conversations that suggest their status is built on exclusion and exploitation. This denial is not simply ignorance, it is a survival strategy for maintaining racial dominance without overt hostility. People fear to be called out, and so they'll find ways of smoothing this, what is called racism. They'll find ways of making it not look or making it not seem like it's a problem that is affecting people in the United States, while in reality, this is a problem that affects, in fact, a lot of people in the United States. I'm also going to be talking about structural racism and white amnesia. Dr. Tim Wise critiques the way America rewrites or forgets its own history to avoid accountability. Structural racism, this includes laws, policies, and practices that disadvantage black people and other minorities, did not disappear with the civil rights movement. Now, redlining, mass incarceration, school segregation, and wealth inequality are modern manifestations of an old system. Yet, many white Americans have been socialized to believe that these issues are either resolved or are the fault of those who suffer from them. This amnesia is cultivated by selective history curricula, media narratives, and political discourse that celebrate progress while ignoring ongoing oppression. Now, in doing so, white America erases the structural roots of inequality and further silences the voices that demand for justice. Another thing that we need to talk about is anti-racism requires white accountability. It's true. In as much as black people are allowed to talk about this, we need also white voices to agree, to confirm that what they did was not right. And in as much as it is not them, and as much as it is their people who are there in those generations, they're still held accountable. Because all these things have been known to be passed from one generation to another. Tim Wise insists that anti-racism is not simply the work of people of color. It must begin with white people acknowledging and dismantling the systems that benefit them. This means breaking the silence, confronting uncomfortable truths, and actively participating in anti-racist work. It involves listening to black voices, supporting policy changes, challenging racism within families and institutions, and interrogating one's own complicity in racial injustice. Wise argues that until white America see racism as their problem, not just a problem affecting others, change will be cosmetic at best. Anti-racism, in this context, it is not charitable act, It is a moral and civic responsibility. You are not doing black people any favor for talking about racism. This is something that you should do. This is something that it is required for you. Now, policing speech instead of policing racism. Another element Wise explores is how white America often focuses on policing the tone, language, and demeanor of those who talk about racism rather than addressing the substance of their claim. Black activists are frequently labeled as angry, divisive, or ungrateful, and their critiques are dismissed as exaggerations. Rather than listening to the message, white America critiques the delivery, effectively silencing those who speak out. Wise underscores that this behavior shifts attention away from racist policies or violence and redirects it towards the perceived breach of decorum. In doing so, white America privileges its own comfort over justice and uses respectability as a weapon of suppression. That's how it does this. Let's talk about the cost of silence to society. The cost of silence to society. While silence benefits white individuals in short term, Wise warns that it comes at a cost to a society as a whole. When racism is left unaddressed, it corrodes democracy, undermines public trust, and leads to cycles of unrest and resentment. Economic disparities, police brutality, educational inequity, and health disparities rooted in racism are not problems that only affect communities of color. They destabilize the entire nation. Wise contends that until white Americans see anti-racism as their collective interest, as essential to a more just and functional society, they will continue to uphold systems that ultimately hurt everyone, even if unequally. Also, speaking out as a form of resistance, Tim Wise encourages people not just to be racist, but to be actively anti-racist. This requires speaking out, breaking out silence, especially in white spaces where racism often goes unchallenged. White silences our racist ideas to fester unchecked, whether in boardrooms, dinner tables, classrooms, or legislatures. Speaking out may cause discomfort, strain relationships, or provoke backlash, but it is a necessary step in dismantling systemic oppression. Wise emphasizes that the burden of racial justice cannot remain on the shoulders of the oppressed. It must be shared by those who benefit directly or indirectly from their systems of privilege, and that's how it's supposed to be. I'd like to draw my conclusion by talking about the urgency of breaking the silence, as this is so important. Now, Tim Wise's critiques of white America silence is a call to action. It's a demand that white Americans confront white problem, not simply by acknowledging racism exists, but interrogating how elite, how white identity, culture, and institutions have historically enabled and continue to perpetuate it. Silence, Wise argues, it is not neutral. It is complicitly. To solve the problem of racism, America must stop asking black people to bear the weight of proof and instead demand that white America bear the weight of transformation. Only by breaking the silence, embracing discomfort, and committing to sustained anti-racist action can the nation begin to repair its long-standing wounds. I'm your host and presenter, Jintok Stories, but until then, I'm hoping that you're doing super great. Let me see you in my next video. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salam.